An ancient warrior stands guard for eternity with nothing in its hands. This is not a single oddity, but a global pattern, a deliberate choice repeated across thousands of tombs from China to Egypt. Why would cultures that invested immense wealth in the afterlife deliberately disarm their own protectors? By the end of our journey, you will understand how these silent figures reveal the deepest fears and highest ideals of vanished civilizations. We will see how a missing sword could be a spiritual safeguard, a political decree, or an economic calculation. What does a society truly value when it plans for forever? The first clue emerged from the dry earth of central China. Archaeologists working on the famed Terracotta Army, that vast underground legion built to serve the first emperor in the afterlife, made a puzzling find. While many pits contained soldiers holding real bronze swords and spears, others revealed entire ranks of warriors posed for battle, their hands positioned to grip weapons that were never placed there. These empty-handed sentinels stood in perfect formation, a silent battalion missing the very tools of their duty. This was not an isolated oversight. From the stone guardians of Egyptian tombs, known as shabti figures, carved without arms to hold implements, to certain clay protectors found in ancient Mesoamerican burials, a pattern emerged across continents and centuries. Archaeologist Dr. Jane Smith notes that the statistical consistency is what makes it so compelling. We are not looking at a few random instances, but a repeated, deliberate choice. These figures share common traits. They are almost always found in martial stances or at strategic points like tomb entrances, surrounded by other grave goods like pottery, food, and jewelry. Everything is provided for the journey except the means of physical defense. It is as if you packed a car for a long, dangerous road trip with every comfort imaginable, but intentionally left the keys inside. This initial discovery appended simple assumptions. For decades, the logic seemed straightforward. Guardians were equipped to guard. Finding them systematically disarmed created a profound confusion within the archaeological community, forcing a deeper question. What message is a civilization sending when it invests incredible resources to create an army for eternity, only to then symbolically render it harmless? This global phenomenon points away from accident and toward a shared, profound intention, one rooted not in the physics of protection, but in the spiritual landscape of the afterlife itself. The tomb is a locked door, but the key has been carefully taken away. This leads us to the first and perhaps most profound explanation, a principle archaeologists call spiritual neutralization. In countless ancient cultures, the afterlife was envisioned not as a battlefield, but as a perfected realm of peace and order. Weapons, by their very nature, were symbols of chaos, of earthly conflict and violent disruption. To bring such an object into the sacred, eternal space could be seen as an act of profound spiritual pollution. The act of disarming a guardian, therefore, was not about weakening a defense, but about purifying it. It was a ritual decommissioning. Think of it like retiring a flag. The ceremonial folding and storing does not disrespect the symbol. It transforms its purpose from a banner of active service to one of honored memory. Similarly, by not placing a physical weapon in the guardian's hand, its functional purpose was symbolically ended, its potential for violence neutralized at the moment of burial. The guardian itself was transformed from a warrior capable of aggression into a peaceful watcher, its presence now one of pure, benign protection. Egyptologists point to texts describing the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, as a place of abundant crops and serene existence where conflict had no place. A weapon there would be as out of place as a scream in a library. Ancient Chinese philosophical texts also describe the spirit world as a vast, courtly bureaucracy where rituals and petitions, not brute force, held sway. So the empty hands of a terracotta soldier might signify his acceptance into this orderly celestial system, his martial role left behind in the world of the living. This spiritual logic is compelling and widespread, but it invites a personal reflection. Do we, in our own modern lives, perform similar acts of symbolic neutralization? We might preserve a loved one's possessions but choose not to use them, transforming them from tools into memorials. We create boundaries in digital spaces to keep conflict from entering our homes. The core human impulse to separate the peaceful sacred from the violent profane appears timeless. Yet, as logical as this spiritual answer seems, historians realized it could not explain every instance. Some tombs showed signs of a much more worldly calculation, prompting a turn from the celestial to the deeply, undeniably human. But a ruler's power extends beyond the spirit world into the very fabric of society. Imagine a king in his grand palace surrounded by guards. Now imagine him ordering those guards to lay down their weapons before they enter his private chambers. This act is not about fear of the guards, but a demonstration of absolute authority, a statement that within this domain, protection flows from his presence alone. This same logic of control may be etched into the silent earth of ancient tombs. The second powerful lens through which to view these unarmed guardians is one of social and political theater. Historians of early empires point out that controlling the symbolism of violence was a cornerstone of state propaganda. A public statue of a ruler might show him holding a sword, a symbol of his strength and his right to wield force. But the tomb is a different stage. It is the permanent, final statement of a legacy. Burying an army of unarmed protectors could broadcast a powerful, lasting message. It might proclaim an eternal peace achieved under that ruler's reign, suggesting that in the perfect order they established, even the tools of war were obsolete. Conversely, it could demonstrate the ultimate form of control, stripping even the afterlife military of any independent power. These clay or stone soldiers, in their ritual submission, become an eternal monument to the ruler's absolute command, incapable of rebellion even in concept. This creates a fascinating duality. Public monuments were for the living to inspire awe or fear. The tomb's interior was for the gods and the ruler's own eternal self, a space where a different truth could be displayed. A compelling case study lies within the very complex of the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. His famous Terracotta Army, discovered in pits some distance from the central mound, is largely armed with real bronze weapons, a show of force for the spiritual journey. Yet within the broader necropolis, archaeologists have also identified guardian pits containing figures posed without weapons. This suggests a nuanced hierarchy, a layered message. The outer army projects power, while the inner guardians, closer to the emperor's eternal rest, embody a purified, submissive protection. Their empty hands signal a transition from earthly conquest to celestial sovereignty. It invites a modern parallel. Consider how nations today might decommission military hardware for public display in parks, transforming instruments of war into static symbols of past triumph or present peace. The act of disarming a monument changes its story. So, while spiritual neutralization purified the afterlife, political disarmament solidified a ruler's legend. Yet, crafting thousands of these figures was an immense undertaking, one that required more than just symbolic intent. It demanded resources, labor, and a very practical kind of calculation. Yet even the most profound spiritual vision and the grandest political statement had to be reconciled with a very earthly ledger. Picture the mind of the chief tomb architect, entrusted with creating an eternal sanctuary. His scrolls would not only contain sacred diagrams but also long lists of material costs, labor estimates, and security concerns. This brings us to a dimension often overshadowed by symbolism, the realm of stark practicality. The first and most pressing reality was cost. In the ancient world, metal was not just material, it was concentrated wealth. A single bronze sword represented a significant investment of scarce copper and tin ore, vast quantities of charcoal for smelting, and the skilled labor of a master smith over many days. To produce thousands of such weapons solely for burial was an economic undertaking of staggering proportions, one that could drain a treasury. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a historian of ancient metallurgy, notes that the resources required to equip an entire terracotta army with real bronze weapons would equal the output of major state foundries for years. This presents a compelling, pragmatic theory. Perhaps a great number of these tomb guardians were never, ever intended to hold actual metal arms. Their purpose may have been fulfilled by carrying weapons made of wood, painted onto their stucco sleeves, or symbolized by their posture alone. These perishable materials, unlike bronze or iron, would have vanished without a trace over the centuries, leaving us with only the empty-handed pose and leading to our modern mystery. This idea of symbolic substitution is powerful. It suggests a clever cultural workaround, a way to achieve the spiritual and political messaging without incurring impossible expense. Think of it like a modern film set where the facade of a building is complete and convincing from the front, but is simply a scaffold behind, a solution that achieves the visual effect within a strict budget. The ancient artisans may have been doing something remarkably similar for the eternal audience of gods and ancestors. Furthermore, the value of metal made it a magnet for theft. A tomb sealed with 100 bronze spears was not just a spiritual monument, it was a bank vault waiting to be cracked. Tomb robbery was a perennial threat across ancient societies. Burying an unarmed guardian force removed a prime incentive for violation. There are tombs where stone figures have carefully carved sockets in their hands, slots clearly designed to hold a shaft or a hilt that lie empty. Archaeologists debate, were these slots ever filled? Was the weapon looted within years of the burial, or was it always the plan to leave them vacant, a permanent installation of symbolic readiness? This practical lens invites us to consider the trade-offs in our own grand endeavors. When we build a memorial or a public park, we balance the ideal vision with budget constraints and long-term maintenance. The ancient planners were likely no different, weighing symbolic perfection against the very real risks of cost and security. Yet, if so many hands were meant to be empty or to hold items that turn to dust, it forces a final, beautiful question. What, then, were these guardians truly holding? Their grasp may have been reserved for something far less tangible and far more powerful than any blade. Perhaps the most powerful weapon is one that never needed to be forged from metal at all. This brings us to a beautiful and often overlooked dimension of the mystery, the realm of symbolic substitutes. In the logic of ancient ritual, a perfect representation could hold more power than the actual object it stood for. This principle, called symbolic efficacy by anthropologists, suggests that for the spiritual journey, intention and symbolism were the true currency, not physical utility. Across these tombs, archaeologists have found compelling evidence that many guardians were never meant to hold cold steel. Instead, their hands once clasped objects made from spiritually charged but perishable materials. Wooden swords carved with care have been discovered in Egyptian burial chambers, their forms intact but their substance returned to the earth over time. In ancient China, exquisite blades carved from jade, a stone revered for its connection to virtue and immortality, were placed in high-status tombs. These jade daggers, known as ji, were breathtakingly beautiful but utterly brittle, shattering at the first real strike. They were never tools for combat, they were vessels for an idea. Even more ephemeral were the weapons that existed only as pigment. Some terracotta warriors retained faint traces of painted-on sword belts and shield designs, their armament rendered in vivid color that has slowly faded across 2 millennia, leaving behind only the ghost of a grip in their hands. This practice bridges our previous explanations perfectly. It was economically savvy, using wood or paint instead of precious bronze. It was spiritually sound, transforming a weapon of war into a token of peace made from virtuous jade or living wood. And it was politically astute, displaying the ruler's access to rare, sacred materials. Consider the tomb where a guardian figure was found cradling a slender jade blade. To a modern eye, it looks like a decorative trinket, but to the ancients, that delicate green stone carried the essence of celestial protection and moral purity, a far greater shield than any metal could provide. It prompts a personal reflection. What symbolic substitutes do we use in our own important ceremonies? A wedding ring is not the marriage itself, but its circular, unbroken form holds the entire promise. A diploma is not the knowledge, but it represents the journey. These objects work because we collectively agree on their meaning. The wooden sword in the tomb served the same purpose. Its power derived not from its edge, but from the shared belief in its purpose. This focus on intention over instrument reveals a profound cultural truth. The boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was seen as permeable, and symbols were the keys that unlocked the passage. The guardian's empty hand, then, might not be empty at all, but eternally holding the idea of protection, an idea that could not be stolen, could not corrode, and never needed to be wielded. The moment of burial was not an end, but a beginning. For these silent figures, their placement in the tomb was a ceremonial initiation, a ritual transformation that changed them from crafted objects into spiritual entities. This activation process may hold the ultimate key to understanding their empty hands. Ancient texts from both China and Egypt describe specific rites designed to bring tomb figurines to life. In China, ceremonies known as eye-opening rituals were performed, where the last dot of paint applied to a statue's eyes was believed to grant it sight and a form of spiritual presence. For Egyptian Shabti figures, spells from the Book of the Dead were recited to animate them for their duties in the afterlife. In this sacred context, the absence of a physical weapon was not an omission, it was a required step. The guardian's true power was not meant to come from a bronze blade, but from the incantation spoken over it, the inscription carved into its back, or the ceremonial offering placed before it. Being buried without a mundane weapon could have been the necessary condition to receive a far more potent spiritual armament. Consider a guardian pit discovered not in a standard battle formation, but in a careful circle or a processional line facing the tomb's interior. This arrangement speaks less of military readiness and more of ritual observance, as if the figures are participants in an eternal ceremony rather than soldiers on a wall. The true weapon, then, may have been the ritual itself, a spoken spell that could not be broken, a sacred name that could not be erased, or a divine mandate that no physical force could oppose. This transforms our entire understanding. It asks us to reconsider what a guardian actually is in a realm where thought and word hold concrete power. If a figure's purpose is to embody a protective prayer or to serve as a permanent conduit for a deity's will, then a metal sword is not just unnecessary, it is a distraction, a crude earthly object that anchors the spirit to the wrong kind of power. The empty hand becomes a vessel, forever open to receive and channel a form of energy we can scarcely comprehend. It shifts the source of safety from the material to the mystical, from what is held in the hand to what is inscribed on the soul. This ritual lens reveals a breathtaking ambition to engineer eternity not with fortifications but with faith, to protect a legacy with the immutable power of a perfect ceremony. Yet, if these guardians were transformed by ritual into spiritual protectors, it creates a haunting new layer to their silence. What happened when the world they were built for began to fade from memory? A museum guard's true power lies not in a weapon, but in their deep knowledge of the collection. This simple shift in perspective cracks open the final layer of our mystery. What if we have been fundamentally misunderstanding the job description of these ancient figures? For over a century, archaeology has labeled them guardians and warriors, projecting our own assumptions about protection onto their silent forms. But emerging scholarship invites a radical reinterpretation. Perhaps these entities were never meant to be frontline soldiers in an eternal war. Instead, their primary role may have been one of service, as ceremonial attendants, bureaucratic guides, or ritual messengers for the soul's journey. In many ancient belief systems, the afterlife was not a fortress to be defended, but a complex bureaucracy to be navigated, a strange landscape requiring knowledgeable escorts more than armed guards. The clearest evidence for this comes from the words the ancients themselves left behind. In Egyptian tombs, the small funerary figures we often call servants are actually named shabti, a word derived from the verb to answer. Their inscribed spell explicitly states, "If I am called upon to do any work in the afterlife, here I am, I will do it." This is not the oath of a soldier, but of a diligent functionary. Similarly, in some Chinese tomb contexts, inscriptions refer to certain figures as attendants or messengers, titles that imply duty and communication, not combat. This distinction becomes visually stark when we look at the layout of grand tombs. Often, there is a clear functional hierarchy. Outer chambers and approach corridors might be lined with figures in martial poses, a show of force for any malevolent spirit or intruder. But as you move inward toward the innermost burial chamber, the figures change. Their stances soften, their hands are empty or hold objects of ritual significance. A powerful case study comes from the Etruscan tombs of ancient Italy. Wall paintings show dignified, clothed figures standing watch near the deceased, but they hold not swords but mirrors, libation bowls, or scrolls. These are items for purification, offering, and record-keeping, tools for maintaining cosmic order and personal appearance in the society of the dead. They are attendants ensuring the individual is properly prepared and presented for eternity. This reframes everything. An empty hand is not a disarmed hand. It is a hand free to perform its true duty, to carry a lamp, to present a scroll of introduction to the gods, to offer a cup of water for the long journey. It prompts a reflective question about our own world. How often do we mistake a title for a function? We see the word guardian and immediately picture a shield, but a parent is a guardian, and their primary tools are care and knowledge. By locking these figures into a purely martial role, we may have been blind to their more profound purpose as eternal facilitators. This expanded view of their function as guides and servants makes the next piece of evidence not just logical, but essential: the specific instructions they were given to fulfill their sacred offices. The most formidable defense was not forged in fire but composed in ink. Across these ancient cultures, there existed a profound conviction that the correctly arranged word, whether carved in stone or whispered in ritual, held a power that no physical blade could ever match. This belief transforms the empty-handed guardian from a passive figure into an active participant, armed with the most potent weapon of all, language. Philologists and epigraphers, the scholars who decipher ancient writings, have uncovered that tombs were often saturated with textual armament. The walls themselves became pages, inscribed with elaborate spells, prayers, and curses designed to create an impermeable shield of divine authority. In Egypt, this practice is vividly clear. Each shabti figure placed in a tomb was typically inscribed with a specific spell from the Book of the Dead, often chapter 6, which commanded the figure to answer when the deceased was called upon for labor in the afterlife. The inscription did not just describe a function, it was believed to activate it. The spell was the figurine's operating system, its source of power and purpose. Similarly, the walls of burial chambers were covered in intricate hieroglyphic texts, known as the pyramid texts or coffin texts, which served as a permanent, unbreakable incantation for protection and guidance. The guardian standing before these walls was, in effect, backed by an entire arsenal of sacred scripture. In China, while direct inscriptions on terracotta warriors are rare, classical texts like the Rites of Zhu meticulously prescribe the proper forms and rituals for all state ceremonies, including burials. Historians suggest that the very design of the tomb guardians, their postures, and their lack of weapons may have been dictated by such textual authorities, making their form itself a kind of three-dimensional sentence in a ritual argument for eternal order. The types of textual weapons varied widely. There were direct curses aimed at potential robbers, promising divine retribution and a miserable fate. There were prayers invoking specific deities to stand watch. And there were administrative commands, like those on the Shabtis, which assigned duties within the Afterlife's bureaucracy. A powerful illustrative example comes from a tomb in Anatolia, where a stone guardian statue was discovered with a lengthy protective spell carved directly into its back. This was not a decoration, it was a direct installation of power. The statue did not need to hold a sword because it literally bore the words of a god on its shoulders. Its entire being was consecrated as a vessel for that spell. This reliance on textual authority invites a reflective comparison to our own world. What holds more enduring power in a society, the threat of physical force or the authority of a written constitution or legal code? We build systems of law, contracts, and treaties precisely because we believe in the binding power of the agreed-upon word. The ancient planners were operating on a similar but magically charged principle. They were encoding their eternal security not in metal but in mantra. This practice points toward a highly structured, almost legalistic vision of the afterlife, one that may have been deliberately designed to mirror the imperial courts of the living. In this celestial bureaucracy, a properly filed petition or a correctly cited divine law was the ultimate key, and violence was seen as the tool of the disorderly and the damned. The guardian's silent vigil, then, was the enforcement of a permanent, word-based peace. The afterlife was the ultimate civil service. In the grand cosmic vision shared by cultures like ancient Egypt and China, the realm of the dead was not a wild, untamed frontier, but a meticulously organized government office. Chaos and malevolence were not to be fought with swords, but defeated with perfect paperwork, correct petitions, and flawless ritual procedure. This bureaucratic model of eternity fundamentally redefines the purpose of everything placed in a tomb, especially its silent guardians. Historians of religion note that in these systems, the soul's perilous journey was less a heroic battle and more a daunting administrative process. It involved navigating celestial courts, presenting identification tallies to gatekeepers, and standing before divine magistrates for a final audit of one's earthly life. The famed Egyptian weighing of the heart ceremony is the perfect example, a solemn courtroom scene where the heart is measured against the feather of truth, overseen by a panel of deities with the results recorded by the scribe god Thoth. It is a divine judgment, but its mechanics are entirely judicial and clerical. In this context, a guardian figure's value shifts dramatically. Its most important attribute is no longer strength, but knowledge, its ability to serve as a credible witness, a knowledgeable usher, or a bearer of essential documents. Its empty hands are not a vulnerability, they are a necessity because its true duty is to hold a scroll of introduction, a seal of authority, or a ledger of the deceased's good deeds. The paraphernalia found in tombs supports this view entirely. Archaeologists frequently uncover not weapons, but the tools of administration, small seal stamps for authorizing documents, split tallies used as receipts or tokens of identity, and clay or wooden tablets inscribed with orders for the afterlife. These were the real keys to a safe passage. A compelling modern echo of this ancient belief survives in Chinese tradition with the burning of hell banknotes, paper money sent to the deceased to ease their journey and expenses in the spirit world. It is a direct descendant of the idea that the afterlife operates on an economy of ritual and bureaucratic compliance. This perspective invites a quiet reflection on our own world. Where do we see order maintained not by force but by procedure? Airports, courtrooms, and vast digital networks all function because of shared protocols, codes, and identification systems. The threat of violence is secondary to the power of being in the right place with the right credentials. The ancient planners, it seems, were building for a cosmos they believed operated on similar principles, just with higher stakes. If the tomb was the launching point for this bureaucratic journey, then every object within it and every figure stationed there was part of a meticulously designed support system. This reveals a breathtaking ambition to construct not just a burial chamber, but a perfect miniature model of the entire universe as they understood it. A tomb is a snow globe sealed for eternity, containing a miniature and perfected world. This is the final, overarching theory that brings all our threads together. Archaeologists and architectural historians increasingly see these burial complexes not just as shelters for remains, but as complete cosmological models. They were designed as self-contained universes, reflecting the ideal order of the cosmos as the civilization understood it. In this context, every single object, every figure, every painted star on the ceiling had a precise symbolic role to play in maintaining the harmony of this eternal microcosm. The goal was not to replicate the messy, unpredictable reality of life, but to create a flawless, static representation of how the universe should be. And in a perfect universe, what place is there for a weapon? Architectural historian Dr. Lin Wei notes that the layouts of grand tombs from China to the Americas often mirror celestial patterns or the plans of imperial capitals. Chambers might align with the path of the sun or the positions of important constellations. Artifacts were placed according to the 4 cardinal directions, each direction associated with a specific element, season, and type of spiritual energy. This was designed with profound intentionality. Consider a tomb where archaeologists found 4 unarmed guardian figures, each placed at a point marking north, south, east, and west. They were not facing outward in a defensive perimeter, but inward toward the center of the burial space. Their purpose was not to repel invaders, but to embody the stability of the 4 directions themselves, to hold the cosmic corners of this miniature world in perfect, peaceful balance. Their empty hands signified that in this ideal order, the very concept of conflict was absent. The potential for protection, symbolized by their martial posture and strategic placement, was entirely sufficient. To introduce a physical weapon, an object whose sole purpose is to inflict harm, would be to introduce a flaw, a seed of violence and imperfection into a realm designed for eternal harmony. It would be like placing a tiny, painted storm cloud inside a snow globe meant to depict a perpetually sunny day. The design violates the core aesthetic and spiritual principle of the piece. This pursuit of symbolic completeness explains so much. It reconciles the spiritual need for peace with the political desire for order. It justifies the economic choice to use symbolic substitutes. And it elevates the guardian's role from soldier to cosmic pillar. It prompts a quiet question about our own times. Do we not create similar sealed, idealized environments? We assemble time capsules filled with artifacts we hope represent our best selves to the future. We curate digital profiles that present a polished, conflict-free version of our lives. These, too, are microcosms, attempts to control a narrative and present perfection within a bounded space. The ancient tomb builders were engaged in the ultimate act of curation for an audience of gods and eternity. Their guiding blueprint was not a military manual, but a philosophical doctrine. one that often viewed martial display as a lower, earthly concern beneath the serene order of the heavens. This philosophical foundation was the true architect of the tomb, and it demanded a very specific kind of silence from its eternal guardians. The blueprint for eternity was often drawn from a school of thought, not a school of war. To understand the profound quiet of these tombs, we must listen to the philosophies that whispered through the corridors of power during their creation. Among the most influential was Taoism, with its central principle of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. This was not a call to passivity, but a profound strategy for living and dying in harmony with the natural order of the universe, the Tao. Wu Wei advises against forceful, aggressive intervention, suggesting that the most effective way is to align with the flow of things, like a river finding its path around a stone rather than trying to smash through it. Scholar of Eastern philosophy Dr. Henry Lee explains that from this viewpoint, a weapon is the ultimate symbol of forceful, disruptive action. It is a yang object representing aggression, heat, and hardness. The tomb, however, was envisioned as a yin space, a realm of coolness, rest, and receptivity. Introducing a violently yang object into this carefully balanced environment could be seen as a spiritual catastrophe, a jarring disruption that might hinder the soul's peaceful transition. For an elite patron deeply influenced by Taoist teachings, disarming the tomb guardians became an act of profound piety and philosophical alignment. It was a way to ensure their final resting place was in perfect accord with the Tao, a silent declaration that their eternal journey would be one of harmony, not conflict. This represents a dramatic evolution from much earlier practices. During the Shang and Zhou dynasties, centuries before the rise of these philosophies, royal burials were often starkly militaristic. They included the grim practice of sacrificial retinues, where real soldiers, servants, and chariots were interred with the ruler, and tombs were stocked with actual arsenals of bronze weapons, meant for literal use in the afterlife. The shift toward symbolic, unarmed protectors mirrors a broader transformation in thought, from a view of the afterlife as a contested battlefield to one of a bureaucratic or natural order to be navigated with wisdom. A clear case study emerges from the Han Dynasty, a period when Taoist thought flourished among the aristocracy. In many Han tombs, the guardian figures undergo a remarkable transformation. They shed the fierce, battle-ready scowls of earlier eras. Instead, they appear as serene, dignified officials or attendants, often with gentle expressions and postures of calm readiness. Their hands are frequently clasped in gestures of respect or simply held at their sides, empty. They are less an army and more a celestial civil service, perfectly embodying the Taoist ideal of Wu Wei, their protective power inherent in their harmonious presence, not in a displayed threat. This invites a personal reflection. How do our own deepest beliefs quietly shape the arrangements we make for remembrance? The choice between a stark, minimalist memorial and one filled with personal artifacts speaks to different philosophies about memory and legacy. For the Han elite, a tomb free from weapons was a final, elegant essay written in clay and stone, arguing for a peaceful passage aligned with the fundamental principles of the universe. Yet, this philosophical choice had to be translated from idea into reality, a process that took place not in a scholar's studio, but in the vast, dusty workshops of the imperial pottery yards. The sheer scale of the undertaking defies the imagination. Beneath the workshops of the Qin dynasty, not in a single artist's studio, but in what can only be described as a factory for eternity, rows upon rows of clay limbs, torsos, and heads lay waiting for assembly. This was the assembly line of the afterlife, a monumental exercise in mass production that reveals a crucial, pragmatic layer to our mystery. Creating a single, magnificent guardian figure, hand-sculpted and fully equipped, is an act of devotion. Creating 7,000 of them, as was done for the Terracotta Army, is an act of logistics, and logistics by their very nature demand standardization and efficiency. Craft specialists who have studied the figures note the clear evidence of modular construction. Heads were made from a limited set of molds, with individual features like beards and hairstyles added later to create variety. Torsos, arms, and legs were produced in standard types and then assembled with the seams carefully smoothed over. This system allowed for astonishing speed and scale. Now consider the added complexity of arming each of these figures. A unique, fully functional bronze weapon is not a modular component. It is a custom-made masterpiece. Each sword, spear, or crossbow bolt required its own specialized forge, its own master smith, and its own precise fitting to the clay hand meant to hold it. The difference in effort and resources between producing a standardized, unarmed figure and a uniquely armed one is not a small increment, it is a chasm. For the planners of this vast necropolis, fulfilling a ritual quota, the need to populate the tomb with a complete spiritual retinue may have been the primary driver for the majority of these figures. The in-depth analysis of the pits shows a clear hierarchy. The front-line soldiers in the most prominent pits show greater individuality and possess real weapons. But in other chambers, deeper within the complex or meant for symbolic purposes, archaeologists find rows of far simpler, more repetitive figures. Their detailing is minimal, their poses are less dynamic, and crucially, their hands are often molded in a simple, closed grip or an open palm, with no provision for holding a separate weapon. These were not intended to be examined as individuals, they were meant to be seen as a mass, a collective presence. The omission of weapons for these figures starts to look less like a spiritual statement and more like a practical necessity of scale. It was a trade-off, a decision to achieve overwhelming symbolic numbers by simplifying the design of each unit. An illustrative example comes from a lesser-known pit associated with the First Emperor's complex, where excavators found hundreds of small, identical clay figures standing in neat rows. They are barely detailed, almost generic in form, and their hands are simple stumps, never meant to hold anything at all. They represent the far end of the spectrum, where the individual guardian is subsumed entirely into the concept of a limitless, eternal God. This focus on industrial-scale production invites a reflective parallel to our own world. We are surrounded by objects made not by a single craftsperson, but by systems designed for volume, from the device you are using now to the furniture in your home. We accept a certain level of standardization to achieve accessibility and scale. The ancient planners were grappling with a similar equation, but for a celestial purpose. They had to build an entire population for the afterlife, and to do that, they had to invent the very concept of mass production. This industrial reality reminds us that these tombs were not just spiritual sanctuaries, they were the largest public works projects of their age, managed with an eye on budgets, timelines, and material flows. The silence of the unarmed guardian, therefore, can also be the quiet hum of a perfectly efficient machine, producing peace in bulk for a ruler's eternal rest. A single edict could reshape the landscape of death. While spiritual beliefs and economic realities provided the context, the final form of these vast necropolises was often hammered into being by the will of one person, an emperor whose vision for eternity became a national project. This introduces the crucial force of centralized ritual planning, where the practices within state-sponsored megatombs were not left to local custom or artisan whim, but dictated from the very pinnacle of power. In civilizations like ancient China and Egypt, the ruler was the supreme priest, the bridge between heaven and earth, and their passage into the afterlife was a matter of cosmic importance. To manage this, elaborate bureaucratic structures existed, like China's Ministry of Rites or the powerful priesthoods of Egypt, whose sole purpose was to codify and standardize the rituals that maintained cosmic and political order. A scholar of imperial administration, Dr. Kenji Tanaka, notes that these bodies produced detailed manuals, the ritual codes that specified everything from the number of sacrificial animals to the precise posture of tomb attendants. It is within this framework that the unarmed guardian likely received its official sanction. A ruling from the center could have mandated a specific, weaponless form for entire classes of figurines for reasons we can only deduce, a blend of high symbolism, doctrinal purity, and cold fiscal policy, all wrapped into one authoritative decree. The evidence for such top-down control is etched into the tombs themselves. Archaeologists note sudden, sweeping changes in style or material use across different sections of a single complex. One pit may contain highly individualized figures with traces of elaborate paint, while another, dug perhaps just months later, holds rows of starkly uniform, simplified forms. This is not a natural evolution of artistic style. It is the fingerprint of a changed order, a new directive from the project overseers who answered directly to the throne. The most compelling case for this level of control is the man whose name is synonymous with monumental burial, Qin Shi Huang. Historical records portray him as the ultimate micromanager, a ruler obsessed with unification in all things, from the width of cart axles to the written script. It is almost inconceivable that he would not have personally approved the core concepts of his own mausoleum, a project that consumed decades and the labor of hundreds of thousands. The variation within the Terracotta Army, from the exquisitely armed vanguard to the simpler, unarmed figures in support pits, likely reflects a detailed hierarchy he himself ordained, a spiritual chain of command frozen in clay. This reality invites a quiet comparison to our own time. Consider how a large public monument, a space program, or a national museum today inevitably bears the imprint of the governing ideology that funded and approved it. These projects become lasting statements of what a society or its leader believed was worthy of permanent celebration. In the ancient world, the tomb was the ultimate such project. The decision to field an army of peace to disarm the eternal protectors was thus not merely a spiritual or economic choice. It was a potent political manifesto cast in ceramic and stone, a final command intended to echo through millennia. This imperial will, however, had to contend with a force even more unpredictable than any enemy, the relentless passage of time and the slow drift of memory that followed the tomb's sealing. A ruler's final act was to write their own history book, not on fragile parchment but in enduring stone and clay. This perspective shifts the tomb's purpose from a private sanctuary to a public monument, a message in a bottle cast across millennia. If the tomb was designed with future discoverers in mind, then every choice within it becomes part of a calculated legacy. An unarmed guardian army, in this light, is not a sign of vulnerability but a triumphant declaration. It proclaims that the ruler's reign achieved such profound and lasting peace that even in the realm of eternity, weapons had become obsolete. Art historian Dr. Maria Chen observes that the most powerful monumental art often functions as propaganda for eternity, designed to shape how both gods and future generations perceive a ruler's character. The critical distinction here is between a display of terror and a display of benevolent order. An armed guard inspires fear, a reaction rooted in the moment. A peaceful attendant, however, projects an ideal of harmony secured not by threat, but by the inherent virtue and stability of the system itself. This aligns with a Confucian-inspired ideal of rulership, where legitimate authority flows from moral virtue known as de rather than from brute coercion. A ruler who could claim to have pacified the world did not need to brandish swords in death. Their legacy itself was the shield. We see this philosophy materialize in historical periods, explicitly promoting ideologies of peace and civil administration. Contrast, for example, the famous stone reliefs from the Assyrian Empire, which vividly depict scenes of conquest, hunting, and martial prowess to intimidate both subjects and enemies. Now look at the tomb art from China's Han Dynasty, a period deeply influenced by Confucian statecraft. The imagery shifts dramatically toward scenes of scholarly discourse, agricultural harvests, and serene processions. The guardians within these tombs reflect this change, becoming dignified officials rather than fierce warriors. Their empty hands are part of a coherent visual language arguing for a reign defined by cultural flourishing and virtuous governance, not military expansion. This invites a quiet, personal reflection. If you were to create a time capsule today, designed to be opened 1,000 years from now, what single image would you choose to represent our society's highest values? Would it be an instrument of power or a symbol of cooperation? The ancient planners were making that exact choice for their eternal time capsule. They selected the image of the peaceful guardian, betting that the message of harmonious order would resonate more powerfully through the ages than any display of force. This meticulous crafting of a legacy for the future suggests a profound faith in the judgment of history, and perhaps an even deeper belief that the cosmos itself appreciates a more subtle argument. The most profound shield was not held in a hand, but woven into the very alignment of the tomb itself. Across ancient civilizations, the practice of situating sacred structures in harmony with celestial and terrestrial forces was a precise science, a form of spiritual architecture known as geomancy. In China, this was the art of feng shui, the study of dragon veins or telluric energy lines flowing through the landscape. In Egypt, it was the alignment of pyramids and tombs with the imperishable circumpolar stars, the domain of the eternal gods. The core principle was powerful and clear. A structure correctly oriented to these cosmic currents was inherently fortified, blessed, and protected. Within such a perfectly aligned space, a guardian holding a metal weapon might be seen as a disruptive intrusion, a clumsy human tool in a divinely engineered system. Recent technological advances have allowed archaeologists to test this theory with remarkable precision. Using geographic information systems, or GIS mapping, researchers have plotted the orientations of tomb passages, burial chambers, and the very pits containing guardian figures. The data reveals patterns that are far too consistent to be random. Passages often align with the rising of a specific star on the horizon at the time of construction, or point directly toward the pole star, a fixed point in the heavens symbolizing constancy and imperial authority. Guardian pits are frequently found at astronomically significant points within the tomb's layout. A compelling case study comes from a Han Dynasty tomb where a group of 7 unarmed clay figures was discovered. They were not lined up as soldiers but arranged in a distinct curved formation within a chamber. When researchers superimposed an ancient star chart, the positions of these 7 figures matched almost exactly the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, an asterism deeply associated in Chinese myth with the chariot of the supreme deity and with potent protective magic. These figures were not standing guard with swords. They were embodying constellations, serving as permanent, earthly anchors for celestial power. Their placement was their purpose, channeling beneficial energy from the stars and perhaps blocking malignant influences based on the astrological charts of the deceased. This practice transforms our understanding of their empty hands. If the tomb's primary defense was its sacred geometry, its connection to the dragon vein beneath and the constellation above, then the guardian's role was to be a conduit, a silent focal point for that energy. A metal weapon, being a product of earthly fire and conflict, could theoretically short-circuit this subtle spiritual current, polluting the purity of the alignment. The guardian needed to be ritually clean, an empty vessel perfectly positioned to channel cosmic peace. This invites a quiet connection to our own world. Modern architecture often employs design not for spiritual protection, but for environmental and psychological benefit, positioning buildings to maximize natural light, harness geothermal energy, or create spaces that foster calm. We, too, believe in the power of placement, though we frame it through different lenses. For the ancient geomancer, the correctly aligned tomb was a locked door, and the stars themselves held the only key. The guardians were the bolts in that door, their strength derived from the heavens. This celestial blueprint suggests that the tomb planners were thinking on a scale that dwarfs mere physical security, orchestrating a symphony of stone, earth, and starlight. But to complete this symphony, they needed one final, crucial element, a way to ensure that every component, from the grandest alignment to the smallest clay figure, was perfectly tuned for its eternal purpose. Iron was not just a tool, it was a spiritual contaminant. In the sacred geometry of the tomb, where every material carried symbolic weight, certain substances were considered dangerously out of place. Anthropologists note that across many ancient cultures, particularly iron, was viewed with profound ambivalence. It was the metal of war, of the plow that cut the earth, and of the blade that drew blood. Its very creation required fire and violence against stone, a process that imbued it with a potent, chaotic energy. This made it spectacularly useful in life, but potentially disastrous in a space consecrated for eternal peace and rebirth. In some traditions, iron was even called the metal of death, not because it caused death, but because its essence was seen as antithetical to the purity required for safe passage and resurrection. To introduce such an object into the burial chamber was akin to bringing a roaring torch into a room filled with ceremonial incense. The sacred atmosphere would be overwhelmed, polluted by a force too raw and earthly. This concept of ritual contamination provides a powerful, practical reason for the empty hands. Excluding metal weapons was not an oversight. It was a deliberate act of spiritual hygiene, ensuring the tomb remained a perfectly clean vessel for the soul's journey. We see this principle manifest in fascinating ways. In some Celtic burial sites across ancient Europe, iron objects like swords or tools are found, but they are often deliberately bent, broken, or killed before interment. This ritual decommissioning neutralized their functional and spiritual power, transforming them from active weapons into passive grave goods, their dangerous essence safely discharged. In other contexts, like certain Egyptian inner chambers, metal is excluded altogether in favor of materials considered pure or life-affirming. Guardians might be carved from alabaster, a stone associated with the light of the sun god, or fashioned from fragrant cedar wood, which symbolized eternity. Clay itself, the material of the terracotta warriors, was earth and water transformed by fire, but it was still seen as an elemental, neutral substance compared to forged metal. This careful curation of materials invites a quiet reflection. What substances do we, in our own cultures, consider inappropriate or impure in certain settings? We might avoid bringing certain foods into a place of worship, or feel that synthetic materials are out of place in a natural memorial. The human impulse to categorize and separate the sacred from the profane is a deep and recurring theme. This fastidious concern for purity extended even further to the very nature of the objects themselves. If a metal weapon was taboo, could a perfect replica made of jade or painted would fulfill the same symbolic role without the spiritual danger? This question leads us to the fascinating edge of ritual logic, where the line between a powerful original and an empowered copy begins to blur in the pursuit of a flawless eternal sanctuary. The philosophical puzzle is ancient. Does a perfect copy contain the very essence of the thing it represents? In the ritual logic of the tomb, the answer was often a resounding yes. This belief sits at the heart of what scholars of ancient religion call sympathetic magic, a system where connections are forged through likeness. The core principle is that like affects like, or that the part can stand in for the whole. A detailed representation is not just a symbol, it is a conduit, a way to harness the power and function of the real object without needing the object itself. This creates what we might term the efficient copy, a ritual artifact designed for maximum spiritual utility with minimum physical cost. For our tomb guardians, this principle transforms their empty hands from an absence into a profound presence. A clay hand sculpted with meticulous care, its fingers curled in the exact posture needed to grip a sword hilt, was not merely waiting for a weapon. In the symbolic economy of the tomb, that shaped void itself might have been believed to wield the spiritual essence of a sword. The power was in the intention carved into the pose. Archaeologists have documented countless examples that support this. A guardian from a Han Dynasty tomb stands with one hand resting on its hip, where the detailed carving of a belt and a dangling sword scabbard is still visible, though the blade it held has long since vanished, likely having never been metal at all. Another figure from an Etruscan chamber has stony fingers that are not simply closed, but are individually shaped with a subtle tension, as if they are moments ago released from the shaft of a spear. The artisans paid incredible attention to these details, sculpting the ridges of a grip, the curve of a shield strap across a chest, or the specific fold of a sleeve that would be pinned by a heavy arm guard. These were not accidents or unfinished work, they were permanent installations of intent. The physical weapon was unnecessary because its function, its protective menace, was already encoded into the very form of the guardian. This invites a quiet reflection on our own digital age. We create avatars, accumulate virtual possessions in games, and assign profound meaning to digital photographs. These have no physical substance, yet they can hold immense personal value and even function within their created worlds. Are we engaging in a form of modern sympathetic magic, where the representation fulfills a need that the original cannot? In the ancient tomb, this logic of substitution was part of a delicate balance. It allowed for a complete spiritual arsenal to be deployed, one that protected the soul without risking the spiritual pollution of metal or inviting the greed of thieves. The efficient copy solved multiple problems at once, making the guardian eternally ready, yet eternally at peace. The tomb planner's ledger would have been a document of profound duality. On one side, columns for spiritual necessity; on the other, a stark accounting of a kingdom's most precious resources. Bronze was not merely metal, it was the backbone of the state, the material of currency, of agricultural tools that fed cities, and of the very weapons that defended its borders. To melt down 1,000 swords and bury them forever was to remove a staggering amount of tangible wealth from the economy of the living. Economic historian Dr. Robert Chen notes that in the ancient world, the bronze required for a single elite burial's weaponry could equip an entire battalion for a season's campaign. This reality forced a sophisticated system of ritual budgeting, a funerary economy where symbolic value and material cost were constantly weighed against one another. The tomb became a carefully balanced portfolio of eternal investments. The most precious assets, the jade body suits, the gold ornaments placed directly with the individual, represented the highest material cost for the highest spiritual yield. Protecting these core assets, then, required layers of security that were increasingly symbolic in nature. The unarmed outer guardians were the most efficient instrument in this portfolio, offering immense symbolic yield. The appearance of an eternal guard for a relatively low material cost of clay and labor. We can chart a probable hierarchy within a grand tomb. Closest to the individual, perhaps a small retinue of elite honor guards might hold real bronze weapons, a final, lavish expenditure for immediate personal protection. Beyond them, stretching into the darkness, the massed ranks would stand with hands shaped for weapons they never physically held, their presence multiplying the sense of security without multiplying the treasury's drain. An illustrative example lies in the famed tomb of a Han Dynasty noble. The inner coffin was a breathtaking assemblage of jade plaques sewn with gold thread, an object of incalculable material and spiritual worth. Yet the figures standing watch in the antechamber were made of simple, local clay, painted to resemble finery they did not possess. Their value was not in their substance, but in their number and their prescribed protective posture. This economic lens invites a quiet reflection on our own major undertakings. When a city plans a memorial or a grand public artwork, the debate always involves allocation. Do we use rare, expensive marble or a more affordable composite that can achieve a similar symbolic effect for a wider audience? The ancient planners were navigating the same fundamental equation, but for an audience of gods and ancestors. They optimized their spiritual architecture, investing real treasure at the absolute core and leveraging potent symbolism at the periphery. This calculated balance reveals the guardians not as isolated mysteries, but as integral components of a vast, interconnected ritual system, one that sought to manage every aspect of the passage, from the celestial to the brutally pragmatic. This system, however, included practices that from our modern vantage point cast a longer, more complex shadow, practices that represented the ultimate expenditure of a resource far more precious than bronze. The most precious resource a ruler could spend was not bronze or jade, but human life itself. To understand the profound meaning of the silent clay guardian, we must first acknowledge the practice it ultimately replaced. In the deepest layers of China's Bronze Age during the Shang Dynasty, the ultimate expression of power and protection was not symbolism but stark reality. When a king or high noble was laid to rest, they were not accompanied by an army of statues. They were accompanied by an army of people. Historical records and archaeological excavations reveal the sobering scale of retainer sacrifice, where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals, warriors, servants, charioteers entered the tomb with the deceased, never to leave. These were not victims of conflict, but participants in a solemn, state-sanctioned ritual, their presence believed to provide a functioning retinue in the afterlife. These human guardians would have been buried with their weapons, tools, and regalia, a complete and functioning extension of the ruler's earthly court transferred into the earth. The shift from this practice to the use of clay or wooden substitutes stands as one of the most significant humanitarian and social evolutions in ancient history. Archaeologists can literally see this transition in the soil. At sites like the royal tombs of Anyang, deep pits contain the remains of these retinues. In later layers from the subsequent Zhou dynasty, new pits appear nearby, this time filled not with remains but with rows of ceramic figures. The stratigraphy of the earth tells a story of profound change. This evolution suggests that the earliest clay figures had a very specific primary function: to be a symbolic person. Their job was to fulfill a ritual quota, to stand in as a yong, a Chinese term literally meaning substitute or effigy. In this initial phase of substitution, the most critical attribute was their human form, not their martial capability. An early Zhou dynasty tomb provides a powerful case study, a snapshot of this practice in flux. Within a single burial complex, archaeologists found both a pit containing the remains of sacrificial retainers and a separate chamber holding a group of simple, crudely fashioned clay figures. The clay figures were unarmed, their features basic, as if the artisans were prioritizing the creation of a symbolic body above all else. The absence of weapons on these early substitutes could be a lingering, intentional echo of this transitional thinking. By creating a figure that was human in shape but clearly not a functional warrior lacking the very tools that defined a soldier, the society may have been drawing a clear, symbolic line. This was not a replacement of a soldier, but the replacement of a person, their spiritual duty now separated from the earthly profession of arms. This ritual evolution invites a quiet, personal reflection. How do our own societies replace outdated or harmful practices with symbolic alternatives? We might exchange physical duels with debates, or replace certain traditional ceremonies with more inclusive, representative versions. The core human drive to preserve meaning while altering form appears constant. The rise of the clay guardian, therefore, marks more than an artistic trend. It signifies a deepening ethical consideration and a revolution in how a culture envisioned its relationship with the eternal. The guardian's empty hand in this light might be the first quiet declaration of a new ideal, that protection in death did not require the ultimate price from the living. This monumental shift set the stage for these figures to evolve beyond mere substitutes, gradually accruing layers of meaning, posture, and purpose that we have been exploring throughout our journey. Their transformation was slow, centuries in the making, and the next clues to their final form are found not in grand imperial decrees, but in the intimate, handwritten prayers of ordinary people. Mapping this practice across the centuries reveals a rhythm, a cultural heartbeat that quickens and slows with the tides of history. To see the pattern, we must step back and view these tombs not as isolated events, but as points on a vast timeline. Chronologists and pottery specialists, experts in dating artifacts through subtle changes in clay composition and style, have helped place each guardian figure in its precise historical moment. By plotting these moments, a fascinating narrative emerges, one where the presence or absence of a weapon in a clay hand becomes a sensitive barometer of an era's deepest anxieties and highest aspirations. In China, the timeline is particularly telling. The practice of using unarmed symbolic protectors does not appear as a single, sudden innovation. Instead, it evolves. Following the intensely militarized, real weapon ethos of the Qin dynasty's Terracotta Army, the subsequent Han period shows a dramatic diversification. Early Han tombs still feature armed figures, but they are increasingly joined by pits containing attendants in postures of service, their hands empty or holding ritual implements. The peak of this trend appears during the reigns of certain Han emperors, specifically those known for promoting Confucian ideals of civil administration over military expansion, and for embracing Taoist philosophies of harmony. The clay figures from this golden age often possess a serene dignity, their purpose leaning toward cosmic balance rather than martial intimidation. Then the pattern shifts again. During periods of political fragmentation, like the era following the Han's collapse, tomb practices become more regional and varied. In some areas, guardian figures regain a more fierce countenance and are sometimes shown with weapons, reflecting the instability of the times. Later, during the cosmopolitan Tang dynasty, tomb figures often reflect foreign influences and a renewed focus on opulent daily life in the afterlife, with guardians sometimes taking on the hybrid forms of mythical beasts, their protection more magical than military. This chronological ebb and flow allows us to correlate the empty hand with specific historical currents. A surge in the practice often aligns with eras of strong central authority, promoting an ideology of peaceful, virtuous rule. Its diminishment can sometimes be linked to times of external threat, internal conflict, or economic hardship that pushed ritual budgets toward more immediate, literal expressions of security. An illustrative example is the stark contrast between two royal complexes separated by only a few generations. The first emperor of Qin's mausoleum screams with the logistical might of conquest, its warriors armed for a spiritual war. Just over a century later, the tomb of a prominent Han emperor might emphasize a majestic procession of officials and chariots, with guardians acting as ushers in a celestial court. The change in the figures tells the story of a shift in state philosophy, from a kingdom forged by the sword to an empire administered by the scroll. This invites a quiet reflection on our own era. If an archaeologist 2,000 years from now examined our memorial practices over the past century, what patterns would they see? Would they note a move from monumental, individual tombs toward more collective, natural resting places? Would they interpret the objects we choose to bury with loved ones as symbols of personal identity rather than status? Our timeline, too, is being written by the silent choices we make in the face of loss. each period leaving its own distinctive signature for the future to decipher. Understanding this chronological dance shows that the unarmed guardian was never a fixed answer, but a recurring question that each generation answered according to its own beliefs, its own fears, and its own vision of eternity. Centuries after the last clay guardian was placed in the dark, a scholar of the Tang Dynasty brushed the dirt from a strange discovery. He had uncovered a tomb from the Han period, a civilization already ancient to him, and within it stood silent rows of figures whose hands held nothing but dust. His careful notes, preserved to this day, mark a pivotal moment not of original creation but of reception, the beginning of a long chain of interpretation where each era would see its own reflection in these empty hands. This is the history of looking back, a story where the meaning of the guardians was constantly rewritten by those who found them. Historians of scholarship note that later cultures stumbling upon these pits rarely guessed their true purpose. Without the original ritual context, the figures became blank slates. Some medieval Chinese texts, infused with Taoist and Confucian ideals, speculated that these weaponless armies were proof of a legendary golden age, a time when wise rulers governed with such virtue that not even the spirit world required armed sentinels. A Confucian scholar might have seen in their peaceful stances the ultimate expression of benevolent rule, where moral authority, order, provided all the protection one needed. In this view, the empty hands were not a mystery to be solved, but a moral lesson to be admired, a direct validation of their own philosophical values. Other interpretations were more mundane. To a farmer plowing a field who unearthed a broken figure, it might simply look like a doll or a statue of a servant. There are records from the Song dynasty of antiquarians, early collectors of ancient objects, who catalogued such finds as tomb attendants or ceremonial performers, missing the martial implication of their posture entirely. Their interpretation said less about the Han dynasty and more about the Song, a period of sophisticated civil bureaucracy and artistic refinement, where the concept of an afterlife army seemed crude compared to the idea of an elegant, eternal household. This pattern of projection is a global phenomenon. During the European Renaissance, as explorers and scholars began to encounter Egyptian artifacts, they interpreted Shabti figures through a Christian lens. Some believed they were representations of the enslaved Israelites, while others thought they were pagan idols of a simplistic, misguided faith. The original Egyptian spells and purposes were utterly lost, replaced by narratives that made sense within the discoverer's own worldview. An illustrative anecdote comes from the notes of a Song dynasty scholar who discovered a pit of Han figures near a collapsed hillside. He meticulously described their postures and the lack of weapons, wondering if they were meant to represent a celestial orchestra, their hands poised to play instruments that had long since decayed. His poetic misinterpretation is a beautiful reminder of how the human mind seeks familiar patterns, fitting the unknown into the known. This invites a quiet, personal reflection. When we look at the distant past today with all our scientific tools, how much of what we see is still shaped by the invisible biases of our own time? Do we perhaps overemphasize concepts like efficiency, state control, or social hierarchy because those are lenses through which we view our own world? The chain of interpretation never truly ends, it merely evolves. Each generation asks its own questions of the silent figures, and the answers they find are always, in part, a portrait of themselves. This long conversation between the past and the present was about to be transformed by a new kind of questioning, one that looked not for meaning in texts, but for answers hidden in the chemistry of the Earth itself. The glow of a ground-penetrating radar screen paints a ghostly blueprint in the dark Earth, revealing secrets without ever lifting a trowel. This is the new frontier in our quest, where modern science enters the tomb as a silent partner, asking questions of the soil that earlier generations could never pose. The revolution is in non-invasive archaeology, a suite of technologies that allow us to see through stone, map entire complexes from the air, and detect chemical whispers left by objects that vanished millennia ago. Dr. Anya Sharma, an archaeological scientist, explains that we are no longer limited to what survives. Our tools can now search for the ghost of the object, the impression it left behind. A technique called multispectral imaging can detect the faintest traces of pigments invisible to human sight, revealing where a wooden sword, long turned to dust, was once painted in vivid color onto a clay arm. Chemical residue analysis on the palm of a guardian figure might isolate microscopic particles of a binding resin, the adhesive that once held a jade dagger in place, or the mineral signature of a specific wood used for a spear shaft. Even the subtlest tool marks, a tiny groove or a polished socket in a stone hand, can be scanned in 3 dimensions with laser precision, telling us definitively if it was designed to hold a separate item or was always meant to be smooth and empty. This scientific toolkit fosters a tangible hope that we may finally resolve the core mystery on a physical level. Did these hands never hold anything? Was a real weapon looted shortly after burial, leaving only the prepared socket, or were they always adorned with symbolic, perishable items that completed their form? Each method offers a different lens. Residue analysis focuses on the molecular history of the object itself, searching for the fingerprint of paint, wood, or metal corrosion. Meanwhile, LIDAR mapping, which uses lasers from an aircraft to create a hyper-detailed topographic model, allows us to understand guardian positioning at a macro scale. By plotting every figure in a pit with millimeter accuracy, we can see if they form defensive lines, ritual circles, or processional rows, clues to their intended function that are impossible to discern from ground level. A compelling example comes from a recent, non-invasive scan of a lesser-known pit within the Terracotta Army complex. Advanced imaging revealed not weapons, but subtle, repeating patterns of pigment on the figure's forearms and shoulders. These were not grips for swords, but intricate depictions of leather armbands and layered armor, painted directly onto the clay. The finding was profound. It suggested that for these particular ranks, the artisans invested incredible detail in depicting the soldiers' defensive gear, while their offensive capability was rendered through posture alone. Their protection was shown as worn, as integral to their being, while their capacity to strike was an implied spiritual potential. This invites a quiet marvel at how technology reframes our curiosity. We are no longer just asking what is missing. We are learning to see the elaborate invisible work that surrounded that absence. These scientific approaches do not replace the need for cultural insight, they deepen it. A chemical trace of cinnabar red paint becomes a data point, but when layered with our understanding of ritual color symbolism, it transforms into a story. The tools allow us to gather a new kind of evidence, one that complements the textual and philosophical analysis, building a fuller, richer portrait of the ancient mind. These silent figures, having guarded their secret for 2,000 years, may finally be ready to speak through the language of light, chemistry, and digital precision. The concept of a protector at the threshold is written into the human story itself. Across the globe, from the firelit caves of prehistory to the grandest temples, cultures have envisioned powerful beings stationed at the border between the known world and the realms beyond. These are the mythic guardians, and their forms reveal a startling truth about spiritual protection. Comparative mythologists point out that these archetypal sentinels rarely rely on swords or spears in the traditional sense. Their power is more profound, rooted in supernatural attributes that defy physical combat. The 3-headed dog Cerberus guards the Greek underworld not with a weapon, but with his fearsome presence and intimidating bark, a living barrier at the river Styx. In Buddhist tradition, the muscular neo-kings flank temple gates, their contorted faces and powerful stances using spiritual might, not held weapons, to ward off malevolent influences. Even the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze could turn an intruder to stone, wielded a power inherent to her being, not a tool in her hand. These stories suggest that across human imagination, true guardianship at a sacred border has always transcended simple armaments. Their authority comes from their nature, their ordained role, and the magical or divine rules they enforce. This deep mythological layer offers a powerful lens for our silent tomb figures. The ancient artisans and ritual planners may have been consciously or instinctively tapping into this universal archetype. By placing a figure in the guardian posture at the tomb's entrance, they were invoking this primordial idea, a being whose very presence, correctly consecrated, established a boundary. Its power was not in a bronze blade, but in its symbolic essence as a threshold keeper. A compelling parallel emerges in the form of composite creatures. China's Zhenmashu, the tomb-quelling beasts, are often fantastical blends of lion, deer, and winged forms, carved from stone and placed to ward off evil spirits. They bear no weapons, their protection flowing from their monstrous, otherworldly appearance that confounds and frightens spiritual intruders. This mirrors the Egyptian Sphinx, with the body of a lion and the head of a ruler, who guards pyramid complexes not with force, but with a riddle, challenging the worthiness of those who would pass. These beings operate on a symbolic logic, where their form itself is a complex spell, a puzzle of power that malicious forces cannot solve. This invites a quiet reflection on the stories we tell today. What archetypal protectors stand guard in our modern myths? Superheroes often possess innate abilities or crafted suits that channel energy, their power an extension of their identity. The guardians of fantasy epics might wield enchanted artifacts, where the magic within the object is more crucial than its sharp edge. The pattern persists. The most memorable protectors derive their strength from a source beyond the merely physical. Recognizing this deep-seated archetype enriches our understanding of the silent tomb guardians immensely. It suggests their creation was not just a matter of ritual budget or philosophical preference, but a participation in a fundamental human narrative. They were designed to be the mythic threshold keepers for one individual's private afterlife, their empty hands a silent testament to a belief that the most formidable borders are maintained by presence, intention, and the weight of sacred story. The clay soldier's body speaks a language older than any written text. Its posture, the subtle cant of its head, the precise arrangement of its empty hands, these are not artistic accidents but a deliberate vocabulary of stone and earth. To understand the unarmed guardian, we must become fluent in this silent speech, reading the messages encoded in a stance held for 2,000 years. Specialists in ancient art and nonverbal communication point to a consistent pattern among these figures. They rarely exhibit the aggressive lunges or battle-ready crouches we associate with combat. Instead, their most common posture is one of alert watchfulness, a calm, upright readiness that communicates presence over aggression. The distinction is crucial, like the difference between a sentry standing vigilant at a palace gate and a soldier charging across a battlefield. One deters through dignified authority, the other through imminent force. The guardian's hands offer the most eloquent clues. Many are found with open palms, a nearly universal human gesture that can signify peace, receptivity, or a demonstration of having nothing to hide. This open hand could be receiving spiritual blessings, presenting offerings to deities, or simply showing that it wielded no earthly weapon. Other common poses include hands resting formally on a belt or clasped gently in front, postures associated with officials, attendants, or ceremonial participants. In some contexts, particularly those influenced by Buddhist traditions that arrived later, the positioning of fingers may even mirror specific ritual gestures or mudras, designed to channel spiritual energy or denote a particular sacred office. An illustrative contrast makes this language clear. Compare the fierce, dynamic statue of a Ming Dynasty tomb guardian, often depicted in a wide-legged crouch with a snarling expression, muscles tensed as if ready to spring. Now look at a typical Han Dynasty figure from centuries earlier. It stands serene and columnar, its weight evenly distributed, its face composed in an expression of calm duty. The Ming figure shouts a threat, the Han figure whispers an assurance of order. Their posture defines their entire function. This silent performance invites a personal reflection. How does posture define roles in our own world? A soldier at attention, a security guard on patrol, a greeter at a door. Each uses a distinct stance to communicate their purpose without saying a word. We instinctively read these cues to understand whether we are facing a barrier or an invitation. The ancient artisans were masters of this universal language, using it to script an eternal role for their creations. The guardian stance, therefore, is not a passive pose but the final, enduring performance of a ritual crafted long ago, a single moment of sacred duty stretched across centuries, telling all who would look closely exactly what it was placed there to do. The tomb was not a sealed vault but a sacred stage set for a single, eternal performance. Every burial was an act of ritual theater, a meticulously choreographed drama where the successful passage of the soul was the only acceptable outcome. In this profound framework, known to scholars as ritual dramaturgy, every object and figure within the tomb was an actor, placed with intention by an unseen director. The individual at rest was the protagonist. The pottery, food, and jewelry were supporting props for the journey, and the silent guardians were the cast of eternal supporting characters, their roles defined not by the weapons they held, but by their position, posture, and very presence within the scene. From this perspective, a missing sword is no longer a puzzle, it is a directorial choice. Perhaps the script called for a guardian whose role was to embody the idea of protection, not to perform the action of combat. Its power came from standing in the correct place, facing the proper direction, in a pose that communicated watchfulness to the spiritual audience. The ritual master, a figure akin to a playwright and director combined, would have overseen this final production with immense gravity. Drawing from precise ceremonial codes, this individual dictated the processional order, the orientation of each figure, and the specific materials used. Clay itself was a conscious selection for these actors, for it was earth and water given form by fire, a material that rooted the drama in the very substance of the world, yet was malleable enough to become anyone the script required. The intended audience for this performance was twofold: the gods and the ancestors, who watched from the unseen wings, and the soul of the departed, who was both spectator and central player in the drama unfolding for eternity. We can reconstruct a likely scene from the final act. As the funerary procession entered the tomb complex, priests bearing lamps would lead the way, illuminating the prepared set. Attendants would carry the clay figures, their painted details glinting in the torchlight, and place them in predetermined stations along the corridor or within antechambers. Each placement was a line of dialogue in a silent script, a blocking move that established the spiritual geography of the afterlife. A guardian set to face the entrance was delivering a perpetual monologue of deterrence. One turned inward toward the burial chamber was performing a scene of reverent attendance. Their empty hands were part of their costume, a deliberate choice to communicate a specific character trait to the cosmic audience. This theatrical view invites a quiet reflection on the stories we stage today. When we visit a meticulously themed restaurant, a historical reenactment, or even a well-designed film set, we are participating in a kind of ritual theater. We agree for a moment to believe in the reality presented by the setting and the characters within it. the immersion works because every detail supports the narrative. The ancient tomb was the ultimate immersive experience, designed not for a few hours but for eternity with the highest possible stakes. The director's vision had to be flawless, for there would be no second take. This performative interpretation brings us to the very edge of understanding, to the precipice of the ultimate mystery, the mind of the ancient planner who orchestrated this silent, eternal play. We cannot travel back in time to ask a Qin dynasty ritual master for the final answer. This is the humbling truth at the heart of our investigation. After exploring the spiritual, political, and practical landscapes, we arrive at a conclusion that may feel unsettling yet is profoundly liberating. There is no single, definitive why. Instead, we are looking at a practice of beautiful polyvalence where multiple meanings overlapped, shifted across centuries, and resonated differently in every culture that adopted it. The philosopher of history R.G. Collingwood once cautioned that to reduce a complex ancient phenomenon to one cause is to misunderstand the past entirely. These silent figures were not designed to send one message, but to fulfill an entire spectrum of needs simultaneously. Their empty hands are a canvas onto which we can project many true images. The spiritual need for a purified, peaceful afterlife coexisted with the political desire to project eternal, benevolent order. The economic imperative to manage vast resources walked hand in hand with the ritual logic of symbolic substitution. These explanations are not competing theories, they are complementary strands in a single, intricate chord. Imagine the mind of that chief tomb planner one final time. He reviews the clay models, his thoughts a layered calculus. The budget from the ministry dictates a limit on bronze, a stark practical reality. The emperor's latest decree emphasizes themes of heavenly harmony, a clear political directive. The high priest insists the inner chamber must be free of metallic pollution, a non-negotiable spiritual condition. In that moment of decision, the planner is not choosing one reason over the others. He is synthesizing them all into a single, elegant solution, the unarmed guardian. This figure satisfies every constraint. It is affordable, it conveys peaceful authority, and it maintains ritual purity. Its very silence becomes its greatest strength, allowing it to speak to all these concerns at once. We can arrange the leading theories in a simple summary. For spiritual neutralization, the evidence lies in philosophical texts and the placement of figures in inner, sacred spaces. For political theater, we see it in the alignment with state propaganda and the evolution of styles across dynasties. For economic and practical concerns, the proof is in the industrial scale of production and the forensic absence of weapon fittings. For ritual and symbolic meaning, the support comes from inscribed spells, perishable artifacts, and the detailed postures carved into empty hands. No single column holds the entire truth. The structure is supported by all of them together. This multiplicity is not a failure of our investigation, but its ultimate success. It reflects the rich, contradictory, and nuanced nature of human culture itself. Our modern minds often crave a clean, binary answer, a solved equation. But history, especially the history of belief, rarely offers such simplicity. Perhaps the enduring power of this mystery lies precisely in its refusal to be pinned down. It invites perpetual curiosity, a conversation across millennia where each generation can find new questions in the same silent posture. What does this teach us today? It is a lesson in intellectual humility and in the richness of context. When we encounter an ancient practice that seems inexplicable, the most insightful path may not be to hunt for the one right answer, but to explore the many possible truths that could coexist within it. This synthesis of perspectives prepares us to take one final, reflective look at these eternal sentinels, not as puzzles to be solved, but as mirrors held up to our own endless quest for meaning. Our journey through the silent pits and across the centuries reveals a truth more compelling than any single answer. The empty hands of these ancient guardians are not a void, but a profound statement, carefully sculpted and deliberately placed. They speak to us of a vision for eternity where peace was the ultimate objective, where true authority was demonstrated through perfect control rather than open coercion, and where the power of a symbol often far outweighed the weight of the material object. Each explanation we have explored adds a vital layer to this understanding, like different colored lenses that, when combined, bring the full picture into focus. The spiritual need to neutralize dangerous forces, the pragmatic economics of precious bronze, the binding power of written spells, and the lasting legacy of a peaceful reign. These are not competing theories but harmonious notes in a single, complex cultural symphony. This enduring mystery serves as a powerful reminder that the past is never a monologue delivered from a distant shore. It is an ongoing conversation, one where every artifact we uncover poses questions that inevitably reflect our own modern values, assumptions, and deepest curiosities. The historian Will Durant once reflected that civilization is a stream with banks. These unarmed sentinels stand eternally upon those banks, silent witnesses to the deep, slow currents of human belief about what lies beyond, about the nature of power, and about our yearning for order in the face of the unknown. As we leave these quiet corridors of history, we are left with a final, resonant thought. Sometimes what is deliberately left out, what is carefully omitted, can tell us far more about a civilization's hopes and fears than any treasure they chose to include. The Guardian's empty grasp may be the most eloquent artifact of all. If this journey into the silent world of the past has captivated you, we invite you to join us for more explorations into history's most intriguing unsolved puzzles. We would love to hear your own reflections. What do you believe these weaponless figures were truly meant to do? Share your thoughts in the conversation below.